Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Aviva Chomsky. Professor Chomsky is one of the leading historians of Latin America and US empire. She is a professor of history at Salem State University in Massachusetts and the author of several influential books, including Central America's Forgotten History, Undocumented: How Immigration Became Illegal, and A History of the Cuban Revolution. Her work has been crucial in connecting the dots between US foreign policy, labor immigration, and corporate power, and in showing how the politics of empire abroad shape inequality and exclusion at home. In this conversation, we explore how US imperialism is shaping Latin America, particularly Venezuela, and what a new kind of international solidarity might look like today. Professor Chomsky, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And thanks for that introduction. Can you send me a copy of it? I need to read it. I need to.
Of course,
You
my
summarized
pleasure.
everything so beautifully.
I've been reading your work, so I'm familiar with some of them, so I tried to do my best. But I wanted to start on US escalation in the Caribbean and particularly against Venezuela. We are seeing the Ford Group, America's largest warship, has arrived in the Southern Command, and this is following an already massive buildup in the area. And we should also include a massive buildup also in Puerto Rico, from which the escalation in the Caribbean is primarily taking place. As a historian of US empire, as an American citizen, as someone who knows US imperialism in the region, how do you feel about this buildup?
Uh, um, I mean, the first question everybody's asking me is Trump going to invade Venezuela? And I find the day-to-day, the generalities of Trump are not hard to understand and predict, but the day-to-day actions of the Trump administration are sometimes very hard to understand and predict. So predicting the future is always a challenge because there's so many different factors that go in. That's what we historians do, is look at all the different factors that go into how history happens. But so many different factors at play. So I can't answer the question, is Trump going to invade Venezuela? But certainly I can say that despite campaigning on a platform of ending wars, Trump is continuing in the grand US tradition of military aggression against weaker countries. And there is no administration I can point to in the history of the United States that has not partaken in that grand tradition of military aggression against weaker countries. We've already been bombing not only Venezuelan and Colombian fishing boats or small boats in the Caribbean and in the Western Pacific, but we have bombed Iran, we have bombed Somalia. I can't even give you the whole list, but I think it's 8 or 9 different countries that the United States has already engaged in unprovoked military attacks against these countries. And what they have in common is that they're all countries that have no ability to defend themselves or to fight back against the United States. And we've even heard Trump say, well, I don't think too many Americans are going to get killed, so it's okay. So it doesn't matter how many people we kill in other countries. The only thing he's concerned about is how many Americans may get killed. Of course, the Caribbean region, and I include Venezuela in the Caribbean region, it has a large coast along the Caribbean, has been a particular target of US expansionism and US colonialism, US imperialism since the end of the 19th century. the United States has invaded many countries from Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Panama, or Colombia at the time. That is U.S. direct intervention in central, oh, did I mention Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala? U.S. Economic interests in the Caribbean start really in the 19th century, although we could trace it back even further, because if you look at, say, colonial New England before the United States even existed, much of New England's wealth and the local elite in my area survived on their investments in Barbados, another British colony, in the sugar plantations. So the connection of the economic intervention, and before 1898, well, 1848 is the first U.S. invasion of Mexico, but 1898 is the first U.S. invasion of the Caribbean in Puerto Rico and Cuba. But the economies of those islands that were then under Spanish colonial rule were already in the hands of the United States. That is, it was U.S. sugar investors that basically controlled the most of the economies of those countries. So they were economic colonies of the United States, even though they were still political colonies of Spain. And, the creation of what are known as the banana republics under the United Fruit Company in Central America is responsible for several U.S. military interventions in Guatemala, in Honduras, to protect the interests of U.S. investors, the whole era of dollar diplomacy in the first decades of the 20th century, which is when we see repeated U.S. invasions in the Caribbean and Central America, and long occupations in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, very clearly under the rationale that, well, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, shortly after the United States is formed, basically says that the United States will intervene anywhere in Latin America to prevent European interventions. And that gets expanded with the Roosevelt corollary in the early 1900s that says we will intervene anywhere in Latin America to protect U.S. business interests. It doesn't use those words, but that's basically what it's saying, that if any Latin American country does not maintain the kind of order that we need to protect our investments, we will intervene to protect them. And so the early 20th century interventions under dollar diplomacy are done sort of under that rationale. That is, U.S. investors are under threat, and so we need to go in and change the government in order to protect U.S. investors. And of course, U.S. involvement in Venezuela's oil industry is another example. In Panama, it's the canal, but also the banana industry in Panama. And these interventions don't really stop with the end of dollar diplomacy, because the 1954 invasion of Guatemala is also directly to protect the United Fruit Company from a leftist government that is granting more rights to workers and threatening land reform, or carrying out a land reform, but threatening the holdings of the United Fruit Company. And so that rationale has not really changed, even if it's masked under new ideologies in the second half of the 20th century. It's mostly under the Cold War ideologies. In Panama in 1989, it was under the war on drugs. After 2001, a lot of our interventions have been rationalized as being part of the war on terror. And in Venezuela, Trump is really using both drugs and terror as, the national security, of course, has always been, but especially after 9/11, become a really potent way of sort of corralling the U.S. population into line, because the protection of U.S. business interests is not necessarily a winning propaganda for the US population to support these military efforts, but national security seems to be the one that pulls people into line in the United States. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, of
You
course,
asked
of
me how I
course.
felt, so I told you how I think, what I think, not how I
Yeah,
feel, but I feel angry.
right. I wonder how you think about the current moment in its specificity, given you have laid out a very brief history. And a lot of people are thinking, or at least many people are thinking about what's new in the moment. And a lot of um, explanations have been given, starting from Trump's failure in Palestine, his inability to wrap up NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, his again another failed attempt in Iran. And one explanation is that given these failures in elsewhere, and given he understands the military might of the US empire over Latin America, he wants to deflect by carrying out some kind of quick attacks. The other set of explanation is Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller's own ideological investment within the Trump administration. And the third set of explanation is about this new moment of New Monroe Doctrine necessitated by increase of Chinese investment across the region, but particularly close ties between Venezuela and China. I mean, we know about the trade numbers in oil in particular, which has increased massively between China and Venezuela, but it's not just the trade. There are close links between the Chinese companies, the oil companies in Northeast China and Venezuela. I wonder, what are your thoughts about why is the escalation taking place at this moment? I mean, I'm not saying that the escalation is new. In many ways, it has been going on. People have been talking about 2015 when Obama declared Venezuela as a national security threat. But nevertheless, I'm curious, you as a historian, what are some of the things that you think are probably new or pointing to the future?
Well, I'm not sure about the argument about deflecting attention away from other foreign policy failures because of two reasons. One, I think that the American public in general is not very aware and not very interested in foreign policy. Of course, there's sectors of the US public that are, but I think there's, in terms of political popularity, uh, I'm not sure Trump is really concerned about deflecting. And the other thing about the deflecting argument is that I think that Trump is successfully presenting most of those actions that you described as successes rather than failures, except for Ukraine. Um, but I think the concern of the American public with Ukraine is pretty low in general. But I think in in terms of Iran, in terms of Gaza, um, what Trump is projecting is that these were successes, and I think the mainstream media is pretty much swallowing and promoting that line. Um, there's a few rumblings that, well, maybe the ceasefire in Gaza isn't going to hold, but there is so little acknowledgement in the mainstream media that this peace agreement did not bring peace to Gaza. There's nothing reining Israel in. Um, and same thing with the peace agreement in Lebanon, the peace agreement in Syria. These are so-called agreements that are basically covers for ongoing Israeli expansion and Israeli aggression. But the mainstream media is not explaining that to people, and I don't really think social media is doing the job that it did in the early months of Israel's invasion of Gaza, and really um, uh, helping people understand what is actually going on. I think for a large sector of the US population, it's just gotten too complicated. Oh, there's a ceasefire, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. Um, so so I'm not sure that the deflecting attention really makes sense. Certainly, the right wing the Marco Rubio contingent within the Trump coalition. And of course, the Trump administration is a coalition of different interests. They don't all have the same interests. But I guess I would say that there's the Marco Rubio coalition, which is just virulently anti-Maduro, anti-Cuba, and sits in this mentality of
Did you mean to say
the
Venezuela?
Cold
I mean,
War.
they're anti-Cuba as well. But did you mean to say Cuba or Venezuela?
Well, anti-Maduro.
Okay.
So I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't say anti-Venezuela. I said anti-Maduro, but by that I meant anti-Venezuela. But I
You
also
also
meant
said
anti-Cuba.
anti-Cuba. Okay, but you
No,
meant
yes,
anti-Cuba. Okay,
I
great.
did mean anti-Cuba because I think that Rubio's concern with Venezuela comes from his anti-Cuban ideology. So Venezuela is just an extension of Cuba for him, for Rubio and his ilk, like not Rubio as an individual. Yes, Rubio as an individual, but his contingent or whatever. And then I think there's the Pete Hegseth, which is just like, we're the warrior nation. We any aggression that we do is good because it shows how warlike we are, and that's what we want. Um, so I do think that there are at least those two um, sets of interests and voices within the Trump administration. Um, in terms of US business interests, um, I think that there's not a unified voice towards almost any of Trump's policies, whether it's tariffs or um, uh, the draconian immigration policies. Like, many of these policies actually put him at odds with many parts of the corporate sector. But right now, it seems like there's very little will to challenge him. Just as on the part of the universities, although the universities may be more actually complacent about what's happening than the business world is. But in the corporate sector, I think what I see, or how I interpret what I see, is that um, that people and institutions feel that they have more to lose by challenging Trump than they do by just going along and trying to sort of work with and be loyal opposition rather than actually challenging. Um, so, of course, the military industrial complex always benefits from war. Um, of course, even the fossil fuel sector has mixed interests. Chevron has an ongoing relationship with Venezuela that could be undermined. Many of the fossil fuel companies have also invested heavily in alternative energy. And so, Trump's climate policies, even though he's promoting fossil fuel, the fossil fuel industry is more than just fossil fuels right now. Um, so, so yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on in terms of corporate interests, some of which may be benefited from by a U.S. intervention in Venezuela, and some of which are probably very strongly against any U.S. intervention in Venezuela. There is definitely the kind of rally around the flag that war is not only good for the economy, but that when the United States is at war, I mean, we just saw this on Veterans Day here a couple of days ago, that there is an overwhelming sort of patriotism, support the troops, and maybe some of these sectors feel that war is a good distraction, not so much from other foreign policy failures, as you were saying, but from all the domestic chaos that's going on. And that, well, if we go to war, then everyone will rally around the flag again and support the troops. That could be. In terms of the larger geopolitical issues you're bringing up, like relationships with China, Um, I I do think um, the Trump administration has repeatedly shown itself very willing to um, to move into extraordinary measures to make sure that everyone falls into line. So I guess I could see an invasion of Venezuela as being an extraordinary measure to put all the countries of Latin America, Africa, Asia on um, on notice that fall into line behind us or you will suffer for it. And that seems to be something where uh, Israel has become the perfect ally for the United States in this, do not challenge us because we control the world. So this idea that we are now a unipolar world, and even though economically, um, well, of course, the United States is still incredibly wealthy economically, but that militarily the United States is going to get its way no matter what. So I guess I could see an invasion of Venezuela as serving that purpose for the Trump administration.
Trump is certainly very angry with Brazil given the soybean link because his miscalculation about the strength of the US economy vis-a-vis China was partly because they had probably not thought about the centrality of rare earth, or maybe they thought that they could blackmail their chip card, the Blackwell chip card or other NVIDIA chip card to keep the rare earths flowing. But partly they underestimated that China could buy soybeans from Brazil, and the farm sector that's already under recession in the United States would just be in doldrums. And he's very, very angry with Brazil and its link with China, and that's why he's threatening Lula. I mean, part of it is also the domestic politics and his link to the far right within Brazil. Um, I wanted to ask you about,
I would just also mention
of course,
Colombia as being an actor in this, because I think while um, I think there's an overwhelming opposition to US military intervention everywhere in Latin America. Like, Latin Americans have all been through this and know the history, even if people in the United States don't. But in terms of the I think that uh, Trump's rage at Gustavo Petro in Colombia is another piece of this puzzle. That seeing governments like the Lula government in Brazil or uh, the Petro government in Colombia being an example of not falling into line with the United States and pursuing different kinds of domestic and foreign policies um, is also perceived as a challenge that's just unacceptable from the perspective of the United States. And there's some documents from the early days of the Cuban Revolution that I always keep going back to, where the U.S. ambassador and the State Department are madly writing back and forth and saying, how are we going to deal with this new government? It seems like the entire population is united in adulation of Fidel Castro and the revolution. So what are we going to do about it? Are we going to be able to control him? And a few months in, they're saying, if we allow this government to succeed, other Latin American countries it's going to promote the same kind of, like, we all know the Soviet Union has nothing to do with this, but if we allow it to succeed, other Latin American governments are going to try to follow the same kind of nationalist, populist path, which is bad for our economic investors. And so we need to decide whether we want to let this succeed, because if we do, there's a threat, the threat of a good example, the threat that other Latin American countries will do this. So the desire, this perceived necessity of crushing any slight opposition I guess I see it in foreign and domestic policy. Like, why are like campus protests so threatening? Why do they have to mobilize the entire country to crush a group of college students? Um, but it's just like, do not dare to show any opposition.
I want to come to domestic policy, but one final comment on foreign policy. I think the China factor must be very unnerving for the US administration. I mean, even if they are trying to hide it in some ways, given I think the ties of Latin American countries, the growing ties of Latin American countries with China is primarily economic. Now, I don't want to undermine or underestimate the economic ties that the Soviet Union had with countries like Cuba, for instance. I mean, that was very, very important. But there was a bit different nature. In Chinese case, it's the Chinese businesses that are very, very active, and they are all kinds of businesses which are in direct conflict with US corporate interests. So, to that extent, I think while in the old Cold War, we did see some kind of, I mean, a lot of it was propaganda. The Soviet influence, we know, was propaganda to the extent, to the
Mhm.
limited extent that they have some influence. But the Chinese influence definitely is growing, and it is economic in nature. And given, I think I agree with you that the story in Gaza and even in Iran has been packaged to its captive domestic audience as success. I'm not sure about the tariff war with China has been convincing to any of the constituencies. I mean, certainly businesses that have suffered, or farming lobby that has, the farming sector that has been suffering, or US citizens in general. My own intuition is
Consumers.
that they have seen through it that the US has lost in this economic warfare. And so I'm my own sense is that the US ruling elites, including the corporate elites, but also the political class, must be very worried about Chinese influence in Latin America.
I guess at a certain level that makes sense, but at another level, I I fail to comprehend what is understood as the threat of China. That is, why is it a threat to US business interests that their investors from other parts of the world? Like, why is China a threat? What is that threat? I can't wrap my mind around that. What is it?
I guess
And
it's
I mean, I
monopoly
feel like
capital. I guess it's monopoly capital. I mean, if you go by capitalism's logic, that if there are other private interests coming in and they're competing with you, I mean, if there is Temu, for instance, taking in more market share from Amazon, that's shouldn't be, by their own logic, shouldn't be a threat. But given the US corporations have been operating as monopolies in Latin America, at least they want to, uh, uh, it's not hard to imagine why they see this as a threat.
I guess I feel like I could have seen Trump going completely the other way on China. And I don't understand why he's decided to go the way he has on China and the US corporate sector as well. You know, China is markets, China is rare earth. Um, so I have to say you know, I'm not an expert on that part of US policy, but I'm a little baffled by it. And I
Right.
mean, you know, there's other parts of Trump's foreign policy that just feel so arbitrary and also baffling, like, you know, why pick a war with Canada? Um, so, you know, part of trying to understand Trump is coming to terms with the arbitrariness of it. Like, there isn't necessarily a really strong logic from point A to point B, like there was in 1954 in Guatemala. You know, there's the United Fruit Company. There's the United Fruit Company's connections in the U.S. foreign policy sector. There's its propaganda campaign. Like, you can draw all the lines and see exactly how business interests influence U.S. foreign policy. But in terms of picking a tariff war with Canada, I mean, maybe in the future we'll be able to draw those lines, but right now I don't see them, and I really don't see them with China either.
Right. I think the U.S. foreign policy doesn't appear to be a direct line or direct result of uniform business policy. I mean, there might be different business interests coming together, but there are also non-business U.S. administrative or ideologues' interest in that, which also go in part of the explanation. I mean, Canada, for instance, or even South Korea, Japan. I mean, my overarching analysis is that it's kind of an imperial tribute that they are trying to, or they thought that they would be able to extract at a time when the empire has come under tremendous pressures. I mean, fiscal pressures on the bond debt servicing, and so on and so forth. And so they thought that by arm twisting them, we'd be able to extract more. So all these forced investments from South Korea and Japan, I mean, some of which are actually unsustainable. I mean, they would extinguish the forex market of South Korea, for instance, if 350 billion is to flow into India, excuse me, into the United States in a few tranches. But okay, let's come to.
Let me just say one more
Yes.
thing about, because you mentioned the ideologues, and I think that that's part of the complexity of what's going on in the American right and in the Republican Party right now, is tensions between the ideologues and the interests. And I think immigration is another place where we can see this. Like, the ideologues are just like, stop all immigration, and the interests are, no, we need immigrants, but we have to pretend that we want to stop all immigration.
That was exactly my next question. Actually, I wanted to come to U.S. domestic policy, and given the mainstream media has been kind of trying to silence the immigration thing when it comes to their larger discussion on Latin America. Now, when I read your work and Juan Gonzalez and others' work about the history of the region, well, I see that U.S. intervention at the first place led to a lot of immigration, and then they are stuck with the label of criminality, illegality, and many of which has escalated now under the Trump administration. And I want you to tell us more about it. And then that becomes a justification under the guise of narco-terrorism, etc., for further regime change operation, which should again destabilize these regions and lead to these loops. So if you could tell us a little bit about the far right politics in the US and how that has shaped anti immigration politics, and what is the link between that and these kind of regime change, the justification or the illusion of moral authority about interventions in Latin America. I think that would clarify a lot of things for our viewers.
Okay, so I want to challenge you on two terms that you just used. One is the question of stability and instability. And I think that if you look at the history of Central America, for example, the United States has often, imposed dictators. So the United States intervenes because it says, oh, there's instability, we can't have instability. But it also intervenes when there's plenty of stability to destabilize. So I don't think that the US has a general interest in stability. It has a general interest in a certain set of economic policies. And often those economic policies, if they're extractivist economic policies favoring foreign investment over the native population, which is the kind of policies that the United States has enacted over the entire course of the 20th and 21st centuries. I mean, there's been a real consistency there. The United States wants to promote stability because they want to continue those policies, but those policies themselves cause instability. So and then the United States intervenes. So I think we need to be careful about just the term stability. It almost doesn't mean anything, because like stability for what? What kind of stability? And so the other term that I wanted to use is, so you talked about how U.S. intervention leads to a rise in immigration, criminality, illegality, and I just wanted to disentangle those terms a little bit. Because I would say that it's not necessarily US intervention directly that leads to a rise in immigration, US military intervention directly that leads to a rise in immigration, but in certain historical moments, like especially the late 20th century, um, I would say it's the economic, so US intervention supports US economic presence in say Central America and the Caribbean. And US economic presence it's not necessarily the military intervention itself. So, if we look at El Salvador and Guatemala in the 1980s, it's the military intervention itself that's driving people out of their homes. And they're like war refugees fleeing the military intervention, whether it's direct or indirect or, just sponsored by the United States without the presence of US troops. But in other cases, say in the post-war period, which is when immigration from Guatemala and El Salvador shoots up, it's the economic model imposed by the stability that follows the years of warfare that leads to a real shooting up of migration. And, we can say the same thing about, say, Mexican migration over the 20th century. Like, yes, we can go back to the Mexican-American War and the long-term presence, but Mexican migration to the United States is really promoted by US business interests, whether they're building railroads in Mexico in the 19th century to bring people up to the border, to bring them in to work, whether it's the guest worker programs. So these are different kinds of interventions, or, the maquiladora, the border industrialization program of the 1960s, drawing people to the border and then creating horrible jobs and living conditions for them there. So these economic ties they're related to US interventions, but they aren't explicitly, they're a different kind of US intervention, I could say, but it's really those economic ties that I think are the biggest spur for immigration. But I would also say economic ties in the form that the particular kind of economic relations that the United States has with Latin America creates a need for exploitable workers in the United States. And this is what I call the modern migration paradox, that as workers gain rights in the United States, the need for exploitable workers, the need for profits made by having more access to exploitable workers, and not just exploitable workers, but low taxes, the things that go along with the lack of regulation, low taxes, no environmental regulation, has pushed US investors into both greater investment in, say, industry in Latin America, the outsourcing, and not only in Latin America. I'm talking about Latin America, but certainly this is a global phenomenon, not just Latin America. It starts in Latin America, but now it's a global phenomenon. And the downscaling of work conditions in the United States and the need for more undocumented exploitable workers who don't have access to the rights that US workers have gained, because not everything can be outsourced. And
Particularly
agriculture,
service and agriculture, I was
service
thinking.
and agriculture, which is exactly where there's a huge demand for migrant workers. So, and the migration also, like, so you say that it spurs illegality, but what it actually spurs, and I would definitely try to distinguish between.
I meant to say the narrative of illegal. I don't believe they are illegal. I said that the narrative of illegality.
Okay, but there are relationships between illegality and criminality, but not the ones that we hear about from the Trump administration, which is that people without documents commit too many crimes and kill too many people and are a threat to national security. But so yes, that I mean, illegality is a legal construction that deprives people of rights, right? It creates a status where people can be exploited. So in that respect, illegality serves an economic purpose. It also serves a political ideological purpose because it, the kind of threat to national security, rally round the flag, these illegal people are a danger and they're a threat. And so, but that association of illegality with criminality is both an ideological tool to justify exploitation, but at the same time, it's true that creating a system of illegality has turned migration into something that's extremely dangerous and extremely lucrative. So huge criminal networks have grown up to get around the US restrictions on migration because the jobs are still there, the need for people to leave, and that the whole system depends on remittances. That is, the whole neoliberal structural adjustment system in Central America depends on remittances from the United States. And that's the project that the United States is promoting in Central America. And it can only survive, like the only thing preventing another revolution, set of revolutions, is remittances. So, that's what I call the modern migration paradox. But then, of course, the illegality, criminality narrative serves to justify the whole system. But it's the system itself that creates and makes it so hard. That is, if the United States would stop putting its whole national security apparatus against immigrants, and if it would de-illegalize immigration, then the link between smuggling, drug smuggling, criminal networks in northern Mexico would be broken. It would become a lot less lucrative, and it would be much easier to actually target, the drug cartels and
And
drug smuggling itself.
And what is your reading of sections of the MAGA movement when it comes to their, at least on surface, a section of them are anti-intervention, and at the same time, their takes on immigration and immigrant is extremely vile. It's intolerable, and they seem to. Um, Either overlook this link or they seem to not talk about the two connection. How do you look at their politics? They on one hand they say that we shouldn't intervene in Latin America, we should pull back. On the other hand, they are extremely intolerant about or they don't recognize the link between neoliberalism imposed in the region and the patterns of migrations established, exploitations of immigrant workers within the US economy. They are absolutely blind, or their ideology doesn't recognize all of this. What are your thoughts? How do you look at their politics?
Well, so I think the most, of course, nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, racism have very deep roots in American history. So it's not new. And one thing that surprises me a lot is hearing how much the liberal discourse is like, Trump is doing all these things. Well, didn't Woodrow Wilson do all these things? Just let's go back. Didn't Bill Clinton do all these things? Um, so, trying to disentangle what is actually specific to this moment and what is just really deeply rooted in American history, and this idea that this is not who we are. No, this is exactly who we are. Open your eyes. But um, you know, uh, right wing and left wing anti-isolationism and anti-interventionism have long existed also in US history. And, this kind of America first, the MAGA style anti-interventionism is also not new. It and of course, solidarity-based anti-interventionism is also not new. So like even the term anti-interventionist encompasses so many different ideologies and politics that it's hard to see it as as representing a single ideological stance.
Yeah, I guess the mega
I think a
interventionists
lot
are
of
more.
what's happening, a lot of what's happening in the United States now in terms of immigration, also we can see a longstanding pattern in U.S. history that um, in moments of, or periods, not just moments, but periods of economic crisis in the United States, the when ordinary people are struggling economically, and this is a period of that, right? You know, housing, healthcare, education, food, that one way of understanding that, which is definitely promoted by Democrats and Republicans, is that the racist narrative. Well, it's the fault of those people. And that has taken different forms in different times. Sometimes it has been just explicitly racist. Sometimes it has been xenophobic, which is really hard to disentangle from racism, but it's been formulated in terms of immigrants. And I think some of the things that happened towards the end of the Biden administration really helped Trump formulate the MAGA, helped strengthen the MAGA narrative. Um, and many of Biden's immigration policies felt to large sectors of the population, including immigrants, including even undocumented immigrants, felt chaotic and and creating benefits and social services for people outside the country that people inside the country didn't have access to. So I don't know, I don't think that was the intention of the Biden administration, but they must have been really blind not to see that was that was a likely outcome of those policies. So, even here in liberal Massachusetts, where, when the first busloads of immigrants from Florida started coming up is, oh, Florida is so awful. We love immigrants here. But, after months and months of tax money going to completely inadequate shelter in expensive hotels, liberal Massachusetts started saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? Um, so
It seems to me there is this ebb and flow of the economy in the imperial core, and with that, the labor demand and supply goes up and down, and with that, there is this sort of rise of maybe up and down of the anti-immigration sentiment and policy. I don't want to bring a very schematic mapping of that because there are political interventions at the moment which really up the rhetoric. But there is that element, economic element as well.
But I mean, I think just the recent election in New York um, shows the extent to which, when people can see an alternative way of analyzing what's happening and looking for solutions, people can get really enthusiastic about that. And, I think about this in terms of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, and um, the sort of liberal elite, oh, we have to follow the science, we have to keep doing science. When most people most people's dealings with the medical establishment, and I'm part of the privileged elite, but my dealings with the medical establishment and the insurance industry are so awful. No wonder people want to mistrust everything and say, but the Democrats don't recognize that.
I've been seeing these.
I mean, the mainstream Democrats.
I've been seeing these debates in the Senate regarding the extension of the Affordable Care Act. And it's so suffocating at so many levels because the set of choices that are given or it is presented
Mm-hmm.
are so limited. It's either state sending subsidies to the insurance companies or as Trump is saying, I'll pay you directly, and then you negotiate with the insurance company. While, I mean, we know that the insurance companies are better positioned against individuals to raise up prices. But in either case, both the choices are so corrupt and so limited that citizens overall are trapped. I mean, there'll be tremendous escalation in cost of their daily living if these subsidies are taken away on one hand. On the other hand, even with the subsidies, with this massively expensive healthcare system, there is no relief. And so it's natural that a lot of people will see the system as corrupt. And then the ideologues would come in and say, oh, look, it's the state intervention that is making this corrupt. While we have many examples across the world where healthcare actually runs much more effectively in a fraction of the cost. I
Is
want
that a
to,
question?
yes, my final question probably also ties to your comment about New York, and it is about what can be a let's not call it an alternative left, but within the left debates and discussions, particularly I'm thinking about Cuba and Venezuela, but one can also think about Nicaragua. And my question is, how do you look at the debates from within the left? In the United States, because there seems to be a lot of blind spots there. Some of the articles that you sent me to read, which I greatly benefited from, do talk about this. I mean, it's the centrality of the U.S. imperialism and intervention, particularly in these countries which are defined as national security threat, and part of the U.S. left doesn't seem to understand that. So, as you, someone from within the US left, how do you look at these debates and what can be a mode of engagement within the international left where I think there seems to be better understanding about US imperialism in the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the left? So, that's probably my final question to you.
Okay. I mean, in a way, I can almost see a parallel to they're both debates within the left, but also the pressures on the left from outside that affect debates within the left. And I definitely see that happening with respect to Gaza and this idea that um, if you oppose the Israeli invasion of Gaza, if you oppose the whole concept of Zionism and ethno-states, um, and then that means that you support what they call terrorism. Um, and so how much we are required to fall all over ourselves saying, well, of course I don't support uh, armies killing children, but that in the 1980s in Nicaragua, I think it was really easy for the US left to just be wholeheartedly enthusiastic about the Sandinista revolution and to like flock to Nicaragua and feel this sense that people here are trying to create something new, something just, something that prioritizes the will of the people. And I think that that governments or movements like Maduro and Ortega and Hamas have been so demonized that people feel like, well, there's nothing to support. So, maybe the only solution is the US or Israel or somebody taking charge. And I think that that's a completely false narrative. There are plenty of Palestinian voices and organizations and movements, and plenty of Nicaraguan organizations and movements that we can support. But we can also oppose genocide without, even if there isn't any movement to support. So I think that, that kind of knee-jerk response of, well, I oppose genocide. Well, does that mean you support Hamas? What does that question even mean? Like, Hamas is way more many things than what we're showed Hamas is. But like, why are we even asked that question? But I just have to tell you what a colleague of mine said when we, about a year ago, invited had as a speaker on campus an Episcopal priest from the West Bank who was doing some congressional visits and some speaking engagements in this area. And we invited him to speak at Salem State. And the university, of course, has been extremely reluctant to allow any Palestinian voices. And he worked with the Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq, and talked to us about some of the things that are going on in the West Bank. And his own support for a two-state solution. And of course, Israel has a right to exist. And I mean, some of the Palestinians in the audience were so angry they got up and walked out because that wasn't the message they wanted to hear, but this was the message that this speaker wanted to give. But when I mentioned this to one of my colleagues, I said, you should have come to that talk because I think you would have liked what he had to say. And my colleague said, I said, he sounded like a Palestinian Martin Luther King. And of course, we want to have those voices. We want to have many Palestinian voices, different Palestinian voices. There isn't just one Palestinian voice. But this particular voice, I thought my Zionist colleague would have appreciated hearing. And my colleague said, to tell you the truth, after October 7th, I just don't have the bandwidth to listen to a Palestinian Martin Luther King. So when we're confronted with that, how can we... I mean, of course, we have to keep fighting, but I guess I'm trying to answer your question about these disputes on the left. Like, the left should have room for multiple voices and resist the attempt on the right to flatten what it means to oppose U.S. or Israeli racism and ethno-nationalism and imperialism.
My final comment, it seems to me there is a tremendous lack of understanding about what national liberation struggle means within the imperial core. And this is my experience of having talked to many people from across the global south. While, as we know, that the global south is equally vulnerable to right-wing tendencies and right-wing politics, but in generally speaking, and I'm not talking about the left in the global south, generally speaking, there seems to be a better understanding about struggle for national liberation. So even in India, for instance, it's not hard to find many people who understand that Hamas and Hezbollah are part of the resistance. I mean, this is something you can't talk in the United States. In fact, even YouTube vigorously or aggressively suppresses this. We got it wasn't a strike notice, but YouTube removed our content of Professor Norman Finkelstein talking about Nasrallah, Syed Nasrallah, in the aftermath of his assassination, talking about him being an intelligent person and him being able to speak without a typewriter, or his speech being actually places from where one can learn from. And that is a content you cannot air on YouTube. They have removed it multiple times, and even after appealing it, they said that this is a promotion of violent, criminal, and terrorist organizations, which we cannot do. So there we
Mhm.
are.
Well, I also just want to quote Martin Luther King because, you know, when I said that the speaker that we had was like a Palestinian Martin Luther King, the speaker also said something akin to what Martin Luther King said about how can we go into the ghetto and criticize violence in the ghetto without mentioning the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, the United States government. So, you know, of course, Martin Luther King has also, to become officialized, has also become sanitized. So, you know, would that be allowed on YouTube today?
Absolutely. We'll leave it there on the wisdom of Martin Luther King. And I think that's a good place to end. Professor Chomsky, it's always a pleasure and privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.